Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone to the Garden of Doom, and this week we're welcoming in Joel McKay. He's from British Columbia, Canada. I just learned that he's from Prince George, British Columbia. Well, I already knew that from his bio, but that's like 10 hours north of Vancouver, which is like, I don't know, like practically Santa Claus is his neighbor. Yeah. He's the CEO of Northern Development, and he sits on the boards of the University of Northern British Columbia and Destination British Columbia. He's obviously very passionate about British Columbia. And we may talk a little bit about that, why he thinks it's misunderstood, and talk a little bit about the conflict or the confusion of, the traditional communities and the rural communities and the city folk and the indigenous, and I'm sure it all comes into play. And he's also interested in the absurd and the supernatural, which is how he found his way into a place called the Garden of Doom. He's written a bunch of, they're categorized as horror books. I'm not sure if they all are horror, but he started with Number Hunnerd, which I am, supposed to be Number 100, but it's spelled Hunnerd because I imagine that's how the character pronounced things. It's a fishtail set in British Columbia's Cariboo, and it was published in Tyche Books anthology. Selkies, Sirens and Sea Monsters in 2021. That might be something to talk about a little bit. He has a novella called Wolf at the Door, which is a Thanksgiving story gone awry. There might be a werewolf, there might not. We'll get into that a little bit later on. And he has a new, he has a short Western horror story called Hands, and he has a new book. Well, it's a compilation of 5 short stories, all with very different characters in it. He's got a bunch of awards also, so we'll talk about all of those things as we get through. But Joel, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and please fill in any blanks that I left out.
Well, Jeff, thanks for having me. Nice to connect with you. No, I think you covered off more than I thought you were gonna, so I think we're good. We can just dive in, man.
Thank your publicist who sent me 3 sheets of information and lots of pictures, each making you more handsome than that.
He's good at what he does.
Yeah, there you go. So let's start with how does a young man from Vancouver, usually kids want to go to the big city, but instead you did the exact opposite. How do you find your way up to Prince George? We have a Prince George's County in Maryland. I imagine it's the St. George. If you're in Prince George's County, call it Prince George's County. Do not call it PG, according to some of the judges from bench. It is disrespectful. Okay. Do you have the same kind of thing going on there?
We call it PG. And I think it is the same George III, who, if I know my history correctly, it was the one the Americans fought and the Canadians just kind of shrugged their shoulders at. So, same guy.
You knew him as Prince. He became king well, I guess you're king too. I don't know. Whether it is maybe it's the same George, maybe it's not. I don't know.
Might be. But so I was born and raised in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland, and how I ended up here, you're right. I mean, most people don't go north in this country. They go east or west or south. There's nowhere to go west from Vancouver, really, other than the island. And so I was a journalist, and I covered heavy industry. So I was a business journalist, so mining, forestry, oil, and gas, and that has a tendency to take you to pretty rural and remote places. And I fell in love with rural and remote places and the stories of people in those places, and was tired of journalism. 12 years ago, it was sort of collapsing in Canada, and has since kind of continued down that road in most Western countries, and decided to make a switch, got into the dark side, as they call it, public relations and communication. And moved up here for the lifestyle primarily, hunting and fishing, being outdoors. It's a great place for that. And I had to adjust to winter because Vancouver doesn't get winter, but Prince George certainly does. And been here ever since and kind of doing my thing. It was probably the best move I ever made, but I would be lying if I told you that everybody was supportive when I said I was going to good old PG from Vancouver. There was a lot of, what the hell are you thinking? Why would you go there? All that kind of stuff. And I had to ignore it and just go and start from scratch.
Well, you found your muse, apparently, and sometimes people need to go to nature to find their muse. I mean, all the books are replete with, the Hermit on the Mountain, the Madman in the Desert, and all that. And maybe they're not so mad after all. You don't look mad. I mean, it looks like you look pretty happy.
Oh, I'm pretty happy, but no, I'm a madman. I no doubt about it. Anybody I think who's spending their off hours, thinking up stories to scare the heck out of people is not, playing with a full deck entirely. But I comfort myself in that at least I'm honest about it. I'm not trying to hide my own insanity.
Well, what do you blame that insanity on? What was the thing that took you from business journalism, a little bit dry, looking at a lot of numbers, that could drive someone mad in and of itself, into writing a fish story and then something about werewolves?
Well, it kind of went the other way. So I started writing when I was 12, and I wanted to be a novelist from as young as I can remember, and I always wanted to write like pulp stories, like creature feature kind of stuff. I've always loved it. And then somehow around the age of 20, I got it in my head I needed a real job, and being a novelist didn't seem like it was, promising for paying the rent. So I'm like, well, what's the, closest adjacent thing where I can be a writer and maybe it'll lead to something? And that was journalism. So I went back to university and got my degree in journalism, and then was a community newspaper guy and wrote for some magazines and that kind of thing, and then fell backwards into business journalism. And it turned out I was pretty good at it, and I really, really enjoyed it, despite, it's spreadsheets and stock prices and, big corporate issues. But I found with the stories I was writing, I think it's the nature of writing about mining, which is really about writing about treasure hunters, the nature of forestry, which is, being out on the landscape and impacting it in a lot of ways, oil and gas, same thing, fisheries, agriculture. Those stories all had a lot of adventure to them. Whereas if I was covering the tech sector, or ports or real estate, it just didn't appeal to me in that way. There's something fundamental about the adventure of the resource industries and the consequences of them, and probably the horror of them to some extent, that really appealed to me, and the issues that happen in small communities around them. And so that led to me being good at that. But it turns out that just because you're a journalist doesn't mean you're going to become a novelist. So I picked a path, and I was paid to be a writer professionally, but it was not leading towards being a novelist whatsoever. And I didn't want to write in the evenings. So when I made the career switch into communications and then eventually running the organization I now run, I finally had the space in my head to go back to what I really wanted to do since I was a kid, and found it was a really good outlet. So that's kind of how it went. It started with monsters, and it's ending with monsters, and in the middle was a whole bunch of distraction as I tried to figure out how I was going to pay the rent.
I don't want to give short shrift to the temperate weather zones of this planet, but there's something to be said for, that if you're in the woods, in the wilderness, if you're on the high seas fishing, or not even the high seas, doesn't need to be, if you're in a cave caving, all of that has its own isolation and terrors and legends and things that go wrong, and stories to protect you from things that might go wrong or to keep you on the right path, whatever. Then you add in the 6 months of darkness, 6 months of light, or maybe less of light, and the strange plays of light on the crystalline structures, and when the sun and different things bounce off the ice, and things like aurora borealises and all of that, and you sort of get that extra mysticism that they tried so hard for in the latest rendition of True Detective, and probably missed on most every count, in my humble opinion. Anyway, I know one person who liked that show, so I'm not the only one who shares that opinion. And Steve, if you're listening, you're still wrong. But there's got to be something to that bleakness and the beauty. I don't mean bleak really as a quote, but almost like a beauty in the in the lack of colors that you have to sort of search and have your brain sort of fill in the blanks.
Yeah. It's I think a couple of things. One, I think that the Canadian landscape informs a lot of Canadian culture, and it's relatively unknown from a cultural perspective outside of the country. I'd say I would make the argument even inside the country. I mean, most people in this country live within 2 hours of the American border in a major city. Like, there's really not a lot of the population that's actually explored or lives outside in some of these regional centers or smaller towns in what we call middle and northern Canada. The extreme, shift between the seasons, the distance between the communities, the wilderness, I think informs our sentiment as a people and becomes a really interesting tool that can be a protagonist or an antagonist in a story. And it often pops up in Canadian literature. In a way that I think is different, subtly different than American literature. Not to say that the United States doesn't have the same extremities in its culture, but its sheer population, the way it's been settled, warmer climes in a lot of places, it's fundamentally different. And I think that lends itself to interesting stories. Now, I'm from British Columbia. British Columbia is pretty much all mountains and coastlines and river valleys, and it's called Beautiful British Columbia, but it's also called Supernatural British Columbia. That's our brand as a province. And supernatural because of, just the sheer wonder and landscapes of this place, which is so different than pretty much anywhere else in North America. But I think also the history of the place, from Indigenous culture and on. This is a place that is alive with spirits and mythology that goes back, 10,000 years or more, that has a very strong Indigenous culture to it. And then also, even with the European culture when it came in, a lot of ghost stories, a lot of ghost towns, a lot of abandoned places, forgotten places, and that mark of industry on the landscape. And so if you marry those things up, you've got a place that looks like Middle Earth, and you have this ancient and really robust cultural history of the Indigenous people, and then also this really complex settlement colonial history that's layered on top of that. It's a pretty cool place to explore, and if you're a storyteller or an artist of any kind, to create art from.
Okay, well, that's a pretty good sales pitch. That's why you're on Discover British Columbia, or they put as it clearly seems like a tourism type of not-for-profit.
Yep.
I have a feeling you've done this sales pitch before, so I don't think it's too much pressure to ask you. But if it is, I apologize. But can you sort of, in 5 or 10 minutes, sort of give us a giant 10,000 view of sort of the indigenous culture, supernatural aspects to it that blend in, and the most prevalent, sort of, I guess, European, stories that sort of smack dabbed into each other there. I mean, I imagine there's a fair amount of Germanic, Norse, Celtic kind of influences that popped in there, some French as well, which is sort of the same thing.
Yeah, I'll try to do it and try to do it respectfully. I'll sum up, because it's not my place to speak to it. The indigenous culture, let's put it this way. In Canada, which is the second largest geographic country in the world, I think there's just shy around 500 different indigenous nations across this country.
Wow.
Over 200 of them are just in British Columbia, one of 10 provinces and 3 territories. So the history here, the diversity here, the presence of that population is fundamentally changes. It makes British Columbia different than anywhere else. And one of the things that is so interesting about this province is that across most of this country, from the Rockies east, when Canada was settled, they had treaties. And, not saying those treaties solved all the questions, they certainly didn't. But the relationship between the government and the indigenous people is fundamentally different everywhere else. Whereas once you get west of the Rockies, there's almost no treaties. There's very, very few. And so you have this landscape with great complexity and mosaic of indigenous culture that goes back definitely 13,000, 14,000 years, possibly longer, and very different from interior nations to coastal nations and what their history, their culture, what they look at. But also this big question about who owns the land, who actually does this place belong to? And then the province itself was settled first by fur traders, and then the fur trade that was largely British became the gold rush. After the California gold rush, it became the Fraser Canyon gold rush in lower British Columbia, and then up through the Cariboo, not far from where I live. And then eventually, as the decades passed, became the Klondike gold rush up in Yukon. And so you have that mining history on top of it. And then it became a forestry province. And forestry has been a big and remains a big part of what British Columbia is. And so you have this history of these people that have called this place home since time immemorial. And then on top of it, this European settlement, largely British in the beginning, that extracted from the land and carved something out across a really tough landscape. And the two of those things coming together is really the story of British Columbia, I think, and different than in other places in Canada. And people always say, British Columbia is the sort of progressive left-leaning province of all of Canada, and people here have funny ideas, and it's full of granola eaters and hippies and all that other kind of stuff. And there is some truth to that. It is a lifestyle province. There's no question about it. But it also has some deep roots in conservative thinking and old industries, and all those things coming together because it is a destination for people to visit, to want to live because of the lifestyle, creates this crashing together of all these different ideas and peoples all over the province in this extreme landscape with extreme climate shifts. And that makes for, to me, as a creator and someone who lives here, wow, what a fascinating place to create stories. Now you have to be careful though, because I don't like to write stories where I am adopting or appropriating other culture. So I want my stories to be my stories, the myths that I try and tell or create for British Columbia without, stealing other people's sort of history and culture. And that's an interesting place as a writer these days to try and strike that balance. but it's fun, and you can make up monsters, all kinds. Because, in British Columbia, like as you're going through the woods, I mean, there's big parts of it that are still kind of feel like they're unexplored. And so who knows what's over the next hill around the corner or in that cave. And that's kind of a fun place for someone like me to think about what might be coming in out of that cave around that corner and up that mountain.
Yeah, well, isn't that every monster story anyway, or every tale that moms tell their kids to not go too far, because who knows what's around that hill? All right, well, let's not then put you on the spot as far as being the spokesperson for legends and myths of all the peoples of British Columbia. That seems to not bear. Let's start with you. What was your first story? What was the inspiration? And sort of touch on that.
Yeah, so the first published story was Number Hunnerd, and I was out actually. I spent 2 nights at a cabin in a place called Nechako Lodge, about an hour south of a little town called Vanderhoof. So up here in the middle of British Columbia, and I was out there trying to write a horror story, and I wanted to write something really, really scary, and I finished a story, but I didn't really like it. Like the first draft of it was kind of, I don't know. So I set it aside, and it was my second night there, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I'd had a few whiskeys by that point, and I was all by myself out in the middle of the wilderness in this cabin, and I got this idea about, what would happen if 2 good old boys, skirted from work at the mill early one afternoon to go out after a lake where they'd heard there's trophy fish up in the mountains, and see if they could, catch a record number of fish. And the record being getting to 100 fish in a day. Now, I've had 100 fish in a day, so this is somewhat based on truth, where I've been to places outside of Prince George and we've caught 100 fish in a single day. So that is possible in this part of the world, in a number of places. And so these guys go out there.
Without a net.
Pardon me?
Without a giant net.
Yeah, without a giant net. No net, no dynamite, just using flies. Gotcha. And so these 2 guys go out there and they get in their tin boat and, they're drinking and having a good time. And then they catch something in the lake that's a lot bigger than what they thought. And this is where it gets absurd. They pull up a massive, like, merman. Like, I'm talking like a giant, like, 40-foot tall sort of monster that comes out of this lake in the middle of nowhere, and that's Number Hunnerd. And then the consequences of that. Yeah. So I wrote that story in 45 minutes. It was, and laughing. So it's a comedy. It's a supernatural comedy. And sort of had a good time with it, and then thought it was pretty good. And then I sent it into the publisher. It was the first open call, and they picked it up right away. So it became one of those stories of, just had an idea like a bolt of lightning, got it down on paper, sent it in, sold it, and that became my first professional sale as a writer. And then everything has kind of come out of since then.
But you leaned into sort of the comedy and horror thing a little bit then in the Thanksgiving book as well. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so in 2020, during the first wave of COVID, I had to shut down the office where I work, and so we were all working remotely, and I was in this room for a few months trying to run a business, and was going stir crazy like we all were in the spring of 2020. And I got this idea I was toying with this notion around, like, what happens to people when they go from first world problems to real world problems? And what does that look like? And I wanted to do that based in supernatural horror and comedy. And so I came up with this ridiculous idea of like a National Lampoon style Christmas vacation dinner, but at Thanksgiving. So it's going to be a disaster. There's going to be a bunch of people there who are related but don't necessarily get along and are kind of weird. And then, throw in some werewolves and see what happens. So it's a 2-act story. It's told from 6 or 7 different points of view, which are all these people that attend this Thanksgiving dinner, which is in Canada is in October. So it's a Halloween / Thanksgiving story. And the first part of it is this absolute disaster of a dinner as it builds up and builds up and builds up until it all explodes, just like the Griswold's dinner. And it's funny and all that stuff. And then that's the moment that the werewolf breaks into the house and slaughters the first family member. And then it switches over and becomes, the rest of the story is slasher survival with werewolves hunting around the house as they all try to figure out how to live, but still with some absurdist humor in it right to the end. And so I wrote that in a short period of time too. It was like 3 weeks, and it was a novella. And I didn't know what to do with a novella. Like, I knew with a novel, you can try and sell that, and with a short story, you can try and sell that. I'm like, well, who the hell is buying, novella-length horror? And nobody was at the time. And I've been in the business world for a long time, so I'm like, you know what, I'm going to self-pub. That will help me understand the business and the different things that you have to do, so that when I'm working with publishers on other things, I understand all the different steps. And so I went down that road, and it was shockingly successful. So that was Wolf at the Door, and a lot of fun along the way.
Very good. It's like instead of the squirrel jumping out of the Christmas tree, in came a werewolf. So, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, which is much, much worse. So here we have your compilation book, the book of short stories called It Came from the Trees and Other Violent Aberrations. So this is the description. Tree planters on the run from parasitic insects, period. A physicist who has become the target of a murderous airline, period. Teenagers trapped in a museum with an eldritch horror, which I feel like that's something I should know what that is, but I don't know what an eldritch horror is, period. An escape pit fighter, which is interesting in and of itself, thrust into a desperate stand at a sagging mountain fortress. Well, there you go. Seems like movies that I've seen. And a luckless cowboy sailing across a sea of grass to the bloody resurrection of an elder god. So, I mean, obviously the crescendo there in my voice was not artificial. I wasn't planning this, but yeah. So, what do you got there?
Potpourri. So, I'm a big fan of, as I said this a little bit earlier, like pulp stories, fiction from, the 50s through till probably early 90s is really when it ended, but late 80s. And spin racks, and this idea, of going into a corner store when you're a kid, or maybe it's a summer store where you're camping by a lake and you're looking for something to read, whether it's a comic book or a book, and you start turning the spin rack, and all of a sudden you come across a book that with a cool cover on it. And it's got monster stories in it, and it's by an author you've never heard, and it's cheap, and so you pick it up, and that's what you remember from that trip. That's the thing that you treasure, and that turned you into a reader, or that you carried with you for the rest of your life, or a writer. And so with this book, that's the feeling I'm trying to recreate. I'm trying to resurrect that idea of just a mishmash of stories coming together, something for everybody in there, that makes you feel like you're being thrown back into that old experience, which we don't see much of these days. So It Came from the Trees and Other Violent Aberrations is, as you described it, it's entirely designed to be accessible. So it's only 5 stories. This is not a 300-page anthology with 20 stories. They are short, accessible stories. I hesitate to use the term cliche. It's a cliche, which is page turners, but they are designed that way. They're written that way just to get you from one sentence to the other, to be easy, accessible, to know what's going on. And I mix them together. So you've got, as you described it, there's 3 horror stories, 1 sci-fi thriller, and then a dark fantasy in there. So, and what ties them all together is A, me, I wrote them, but B, this idea of that type of fiction, and then a theme of dread in every one of them. There is absolutely a theme of darkness, of dread, of fear that is in all of them. So It Came from the Trees is a story of tree planters in this part of the world uncovering a parasitic insect that starts to infect them. And it's really a throwback to an X-Files episode from the early 90s, and I come right out and say that. And then the second story is about somebody who invents teleporter technology, similar to The Fly, but I have an economic bent on it, which is, well, who would not want that to come to fruition? Well, it's airlines. Airlines would not want teleporter technology to become a real thing, right? And then the third story is a couple of kids who are trying to repatriate cultural artifacts out of a museum in London. And come across a curator who has who's captured a H.P. Lovecraft type god, and there's these masks that it puts on, and then they try and trick it and that type of thing. And then the fourth one is like a Conan the Barbarian story, almost, with this character who's escaped from his shackles and ends up in a tough spot and has to figure out or determine where his morals lie against an enemy from within. And then the fifth story is a follow-up to my short story Hands, which was a weird Western, so horror Western. It's kind of the next story in that character, John Hawes's tale, where he ends up the luckless cowboy on a ship sailing through the grass towards the resurrection of a god in this weird thing, and it's a splatterpunk Western style kind of story. Each story has story notes with them, so I talked about what I'm thinking about, what was going through my head at the time that I've written them, and art with every story as well. So that's also a throwback to those old books where you don't just have the cool cover art, you have a piece of art at the start of every story to kind of draw in your eye.
Is the elder god that the cowboy needs to meet that's resurrecting, is it the same god that the curator of the museum captured?
No. The elder god is a spider god that was originally invented by Clark Ashton Smith. That's been referenced in a couple of times through pop culture history, and I resurrected for this story. And then there's a separate god called the Silent Screamer for the third story in the museum, and that god, without giving too much away, doesn't have a face, and so when it screams, it's quiet. And so the crux of the story is this madman curator is trying to put masks on the elder god to give it a face, and picks the wrong mask, and things go sideways.
Gotcha. So if we just picked a gentler face, the god would have been maybe appeased.
Yeah, I don't want to give away much, but one thing that I did do in this story is I did pull in some indigenous myth and history into that from British Columbia, and consulted with some scholars on that to make sure that I got it right, or as right as I could, to kind of play with that theme a little bit on where that is. Now, all of the stories, I should say, either take place in British Columbia or draw heavily from British Columbia. So in the case of the sci-fi thriller, it takes place in Prince George. In the case of It Came from the Trees, the title story, which is a novelette, it takes place just outside of Prince George. And the third story in the museum takes place in London, but with people from British Columbia. And then the other two draw heavily on the landscape, place names, and certain locations in British Columbia that inspire it.
Well, listen, a lot of Stephen King books take place in New England. I mean, that's
yeah.
But nothing wrong with writing things so that you can get the details right and the little perks right that are ingrained in your own DNA. It saves you hours and hours of research that you, if you're already in sort of this mystical landscape, this sort of Creole, jambalaya package of mystery and elements and landscapes and all that, and then you don't need to study everything about the Southwest and learn about the Utes and the Hopis and try to find a scholar down there when you know scholars up there. I mean, one of my challenges as a podcaster with a modest-sized podcast is to find people who know what they're talking about. When I have a show about something that's of a more academic nature, where I'm looking for a more mainstream thought as opposed to, a more fictional one, or something like this, which is, just us chatting. And that's hard to do. It's probably easier to do as a known commodity, a journalist, a member of the tourism board there. You have a business in university, so it probably makes it easier for you to draw upon those things. But speaking of Stephen King, and not necessarily him, just because he came up, who or what are your influences in writing?
Stephen King, right? Like all of us. And back to the point that you're just making, I mean, I've been reading King, as we all have, pretty much my entire life, and he remains, like, unabashedly, people make fun of you, who's your favorite author? Oh, Stephen King. Oh, that's like junk fiction or whatever. I'm like, well, he's actually probably the most prolific author in the English language and creator of new myth that is almost ubiquitous in English language culture now of anybody out of the 20th century. So I'm not apologetic for that whatsoever.
That's pretty darn good too.
Yep, he is. And so, but to your point, and this comes back to placemaking and this notion of why I set my stories in British Columbia. Like, I mean, no offense to New England. What a great place to this sort of set monster stories and all that stuff. And Edgar Allan Poe did the same thing on the Eastern Seaboard, and H.P. Lovecraft and all that other kind of stuff. But, when I look at the Eastern Seaboard compared to, a place like British Columbia, I'm like, I think we could have a better horror reputation out of British Columbia if we just got on this. So there's a part of me in here that really wants to harness the place. Not to compete.
Darn Alaska wasn't there.
Yeah, not to compete, but to just say, you know what, this is a cool place where the supernatural and stories exist too. So Stephen King for sure. Robert E. Howard, I always say, is one of my favorite all-time authors. I'm a big fan of the Conan. You can see behind me, there's a Conan comic on the wall, and so that, and then I am all over the map these days with horror authors that I like to read, from Stephen Graham Jones to Paul Tremblay to John Langan to Haley Piper to, like, it on and on and on it goes. It's a great time to be a horror reader and a great time to be a horror writer, and I hope that continues, because all of the incredible authors that are out these days give me the inspiration to keep trying to make a living at this.
Yeah, I've had a fun little bunch of horror authors and content creators on the show as well, and and I've had the privilege of some of them sending me their books, or or whatever the case might be. I've Audible, I read them on. So, sometimes I'll use it. I'm not dying to read anything else. I'll try out one of their books, and then, it's always a nice little pleasant surprise. Some books, some people send me, I don't call any names, but, of course. But, there are levels in this world, just like everything else. And, one guy said he was influenced by Stephen King. Yeah, probably. If you told me Stephen King wrote it, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have said, nah, you're definitely wrong. I mean, I'm sure someone like yourself, a connoisseur, would have noticed differences in style and whatever, and picked it out. But anyway, so that's really cool. How about non-horror? Is there, I imagine there's other things, you mentioned the dark fantasy, and, we were all kids, we all read Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, pretended we understood them in 4th grade when I don't understand them now. But anyway, who are some of your influences outside of horror?
Okay, so fantasy is my first home as a reader. So the first book that I ever read as a kid that really turned me into a reader on my own was Elizabeth Winthrop's The Castle in the Attic. And it's a kid's novel. It's a chapter novel. I'm reading it to my youngest daughter now, but that novel transformed me. It made me realize that you can escape this reality for another reality. And then you're right, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, that's kind of where I went next. I remain a big fan of Middle-earth, so I do read the other books too, the histories, that are in the Silmarillion, as well as the fall of Gondolin and Beren and Luthien and the Children of Húrin and all that stuff. So I still read those to this day. What became transformative for me when I was 12 or 13 years old was the discovery of Dragonlance and the D&D inspired story settings. And I was a madman for that type of high fantasy all through my teens. And to this day, I still read them, the paperbacks and the hardcovers when they come out. So Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss would be of my favorite authors of all time. R.A. Salvatore would also be another one from his Forgotten Realms books. Ed Greenwood, the Elminster series, and Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. I'm, second read through of those. So fantasy is big for me. I was also, as a kid, a Goosebumps reader. Sure. So R.L. Stine, we all were. Christopher Pike's Spooksville series, those were big for me as a kid. So I was a reader through and through, I'd say, by the time I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, and haven't been without a book ever since. But it doesn't stop at fiction. Like, I'll read anything, self-help, nonfiction. I'm a big fan of history. I've got I spent, other than journalism in university, I studied history extensively and English. So I love classics. I love Victorian era literature. And I've driven all the way back to studying the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Old Testament, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, extensive reader of Dickens. So yeah, I'm all over the map, and I love Arthur Conan Doyle too. So you give me a Sherlock Holmes story, and I am going to sit down and read that and enjoy myself. So I'm one of those people that loves that stuff. I love the Harry Potter books. I know that's not popular these days, but they're still, they hold a special place for me in my mind. So
popular, it's just not okay to say it in some quarters.
Yeah, and another series I'm a big fan of. You can see them up here behind me. Up there is Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin series, which is historical fiction about the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars.
Master and Commander series.
Master and Commander. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have all of them of a certain publisher, it forms like a giant mural. It's like one long paint. Yeah, that's what that is behind me. My wife got me the whole collection of them a number of years ago in hardcover. So I have every book and I chew through them. I'm a big comic book reader, as you can see behind me too, and graphic novels. So yeah, I'm all over the map, and it all inspires me. I'll pull it together, even the nonfiction stuff. It teaches you to be a reader, and same with business reading, right? For work, I have to read all the time, and a lot of it is dry stuff and public documents and annual reports. But as a writer, as a reader, you're still always looking at the language and how people are getting stories across, and even if it's public relations or journalism, kind of looking at it and say, well, that's structured interestingly. That why did that get me from the first line to the last line, whereas the next story over didn't? Because that's always the challenge I'm trying to solve as a writer. Is really I'm trying to get my audience, whoever that is, from the first word to the last word, and not be thinking about it. I want them to lose themselves in it, which I think we all do. But I tend to take, I think it's the way my mind works, a bit of almost like a scientific approach to it, which is, okay, what are the elements that give me the best chance of doing that with a reader, and how do I incorporate that into my fiction? Yeah, I really like where genres sort of meet, where you have horror fantasy or horror sci-fi, especially horror sci-fi, because there's more that have been done well than horror fantasy. Yeah, I mean, I guess Gothic horror is sort of horror fantasy, and so sort of undercutting myself, which is fine. I do that all the time. Alien probably being the most obvious example, but in literature, I mean, there's a book called 13, and I think it's Richard K. Morgan. I might be mistaken, but it was. I just thought it was brilliant, and terrifying, and probably not that far from possibly happening. But is there? What are some examples? And it can be TV, because there's so much good prestige TV over the last 25 years, but especially over the last 6 or 7 years with streaming services tripping over themselves for content. But it can be TV, movies, book, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, what are some of your, last decade, some of your favorites?
Great question. Some of it is kind of obscure. So there's a couple that leap to mind. There's a movie that came out a couple of years ago. It's a horror movie called Moloch. And I think it's Danish. And it's about a spirit that haunts a family over multiple generations. And it has this end scene that is just absolutely terrifying. And I love it because the production value is good, the acting is good, the script is good, but it's a slow burn. Like, it's quiet, and it slowly builds into that sort of terrifying sort of conclusion. There was one I watched yesterday that stands out in my mind, called Exuma. It's a South Korean film. You can find it on Shudder. Again, multi-generational haunting, that type of thing. My favorite stuff I like to watch is, I like the feeling of dread. I like something that builds over time. You're not going to find me watching, I like the Evil Dead movies, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to find me as a huge fan of Saw or the Terrifier movies. I've seen them, but it's not really my thing. I like something that scares the living daylights out of you. So The Shining and The Exorcist fit in that bill as horror that took almost a cinematic or literary approach to scaring the pants off of you, which I greatly, greatly appreciate. There was a book I read, it's a classic, but a lot of people, you don't hear people talk about it much, called Blindness, by, I think the author's name is Saramago, I think is his last name. I probably got that wrong. But basically, it's set in Spain, and there's a sudden illness that causes everybody to go blind. They can't see, and then society decays around them. And what it's like being blind, what would happen if like 98% of the population were suddenly permanently blind? What would society turn into? And it's terrifying. And it's a really simple concept, especially coming post-pandemic for all of us in out of COVID-19. So things like that I think really resonate with me. You mentioned True Detective earlier. I mean, obviously the first season is one of the best seasons of TV ever to air. I think there is elements in that of horror that almost feel Southern Gothic, a little Texas Chainsaw Massacre-y kind of, that's in that first season. I don't think they've quite captured it with the subsequent seasons. The fourth season, really, the most recent one, I think is the fourth season, in Alaska, they tried, and it definitely has the supernatural in it. And so I would be one of the people that actually did enjoy that season. Maybe it's because I come from a place with winter. Not as good as the first season, but still pretty good.
There. Let's have our first fight. Because they start off the show with, you have a scene that stuck with me. Yeah, there's an indigenous hunter there. He's got his scopes on this herd of caribou. The alpha caribou, the lead, whatever, bellows into the air, signaling the herd to all run away. For whatever reason, the hunter decides, I'm not going to shoot because they bellowed and they're running away. And they all basically carry themselves, sort of like bison buffalo style when being herded over to do it, but without being herded, and then, jump over. And so, there's something very supernatural. Something's wrong is there. And then this whole subplot of how this, corporation is doing something to the water, and you have all this mysterious stuff, and then it ends up with none of that really matters. And I'm like, come on, dudes. I mean, you put all these elements in here. At least stick the landing. I mean, okay, you had to, give us something about the characters' relationship, and the sheriff is a wreck and she sleeps with everybody, and the sisters don't quite get along, but they want to get along. And all right, you had to give us that, but where was the magic at the end? It's just, where was it? It's like, it just ended with sort of like, there's so many things that you don't see in the dark up here, or whatever. I mean,
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. There was some pieces in that felt lopsided, and I hate to criticize because, man, I haven't written anything that's got nearly the exposure, the success of that, and I think everybody put all of their best intentions and goodwill behind it. But if we're going to be
Tyler Perry's Medea either, and that's not good.
Yeah, but if we're going to be critical here for a moment, which is where I think we're going, there was a couple of things that bugged me. One was, as a viewer of horror and supernatural, I think the corporate story was cliched. So it is too easy to just say, oh, it's a cold, desolate place. That means industry is here and industry is going to be the villain. Industry's always the villain. And that bothers me because I come from a place where industry is the one that creates jobs, that the town exists because of industry. Industry isn't always the villain. And I think people need to start telling stories that actually paint industry in a different light. That would be different now. We've had half a century of industry is bad, industry destroys the land, industry is always corrupt, and it's such a cliched place to go. And so I would say to anybody out there, hey, maybe rethink that. If you want to do something different, why don't you write a story where actually industry isn't the problem? On the Indigenous side, I liked the ending without giving it away, but I don't think they really leaned in as much as they could have into an Indigenous culture up there and what that really looks like. And I think if they had, they could have stuck it a little bit more. It could have been a more prevalent theme throughout that story, and maybe would have been a simpler process because the relationship between the Indigenous people and the land, industry and land, and then the settler community is already tied together. That's already a thing. It's an obvious place to go. And then the last critique I'll have of it is, look, if you're going to go supernatural and you're going to have a bear wandering around that's like a vision, if you're going to have, crazy things going on with people melding together and everything, go all in. Just make it supernatural. Make it unexplainable. You don't need to answer all of the questions. And I don't think you need to balance it with one of these ambiguous endings where it's well, it could be explained through science or it could be explained through the supernatural. No, just make it supernatural, right? That's okay. Not everybody is looking for a science explanation in a story. And I think actually in this day and age, people aren't. The magic, the surrealism is something that I think people will always gravitate towards. So that to me felt a little off kilter. Now people are going to hate me when they watch this because I've just, critiqued a season and I never do that. But those were my feelings on it.
They're not going to hate because people already hate the show. They hate it. I mean, it's probably 8-2. Anyway, and I'm definitely in that hate because you're right. I even forgot about the one-eyed polar bear, which is so important. And then it's I just rewatched Lost, and they also made a whole big to-do about the polar bears, and then sort of made it so that it wasn't so special and magical. And I didn't remember that the first time around, and then the second time around, I'm like, that's not so cool. The whole thing with Walt in the comic books, come on.
There was missing pieces there in Lost. I'm a huge Lost fan. I'm one of those people that actually respects the ending of the show, but it felt to me like there was some really cool supernatural threads, like the polar bears, like Walt in the comics, like the Dharma Initiative that could have gone another way. They could have gone deeper into again, the surreal, the supernatural, instead of this hippie science experiment in the 70s and 60s and 70s and trying to explain things through science. And it makes me wonder if, Lost is a product of its time because, through the early aughts and the 90s, so much of fiction out there was almost trying to explain the supernatural through science. And so it's still supernatural, but here's what happens in the biology that would lead to that. And I think at time, that's hard to lace together, and really pull off. Now, granted, they had 6 seasons and 24 episode seasons, for most of it. like things change and it's hard to write at that pace and to keep every thread going. I mean, X-Files, huge fan all the way through. There's lots of threads that got dropped in that show that you could critique in the same way. So in some ways, I think we're a bit hard on Lost. But hey, we're the audience, right? We do get to do that the same way people get to rip my fiction apart as much as they like.
Well, in fairness, the people who made Lost, they're sort of like the network wanted more seasons. We wanted it to be a 4-season, story, and I'm sure it would have been more cohesive if they weren't sort of a victim of their own success. I'm sure in hindsight, they're very happy to have had those extra seasons and the extra money and residuals that come with it. But it's like, I don't think that, I think in today's prestige TV where you can do a show and have 3 seasons, or 4 seasons, or 4.5 seasons, and you'll find someplace that will buy a show that has 7 episodes a year and run it for 5 years. For instance, something that's been tried and has always been a dismal failure, Stephen King's The Dark Tower.
The Dark Tower.
I believe something like that could be done well now and could have, a beginning, a middle, and the end. And for the producers, if it's as successful as they want it to be, well, The Dark Tower has its own world of ancillary, of canonical fiction and ancillary fan fiction. And you could go all over the place with all of that. And, I'm pretty sure Stephen King, as long as he's getting his residuals and he has some ability to have, well, he's, I don't even know if he would care. I don't want to speak for him anyway. I'm sure that you could at least make the canonical ancillary stories work. There's been some things that they've been tried, but there was a show called Mrs. Davis on Peacock. I don't know what I would brand it. It's sort of genre defined, and I don't know that I loved it, but I'm really, really glad I watched it because I think it was like the most unique TV experience I've had. It's 8 episodes or whatever, and it's over. And it's a really interesting, quirky, strange story. And again, I don't know that I loved every part of it, but like I said, I'm very happy. I'm really glad I watch it. Give me warrior nuns fighting against demons. That's cool. I'm all for Teenage Mutant Ninja Nuns. That's cool. But something that's supposed to be deep, you should at least either have a deep ending or, like you said, lean into one. Make it. No one ever really tried to explain Michael Myers. He's just evil.
No. Yeah. We used to make this argument when I was still in the newsroom that, and it was always the argument between sales and editorial, which is, okay, so sales is selling the ads that, wrap around the stories. We're the ones that are enabling you to go out and create your journalism. And we would say, well, yeah, but nobody's coming to pick up the newspaper for the ads. They're coming to pick it up for journalism. So if you, I know, you corporate guys want to invest in sales so you sell more sales, but invest in the editorial, because if you invest in the editorial, you're going to get better journalism. You're going to get more people that are going to gravitate towards that product. They're going to buy it for the journalism, and now you're going to be able to sell more ads. Now, there's a balance in that, right? But don't short shrift the part of your business that is actually inspiring people and informing people, even if that part of the business isn't always generating the greatest, what I would say, return on your investment from a core perspective, because ROI can be measured over not just, your margin in an immediate sale, but over time as well. And so when I look at what Hollywood does, yeah, there's a place for the MCU and the Star Wars movies, and they've got to make lots of money, and they get bums in seats, and I'm fully supportive of that, and I watch those movies. But they should the earnings that come off of that, the margin that comes off of that, should also be reinvested into supporting the quality, what you're talking about, quality original content, editorial content that maybe isn't making buck immediately on its release, is making money over time as it streams, as it fades into other products or product lines. So you're making an investment over time in that. And you're also bringing up artists and allowing artists to have more creative control over things. So I think there's a balance act in there that we seem to get into this conversation where it's binary. you're either making superhero movies or you're making art house flicks. And it's like, well, no, you actually need both. And you need those superhero movies because people like that, and they're great stories, and they're grand, but they also have the margins, and those can help bankroll some of those other art house flicks and cinematic experiences. And when it comes to TV, yeah, like I'm like you. I like do it solid, do it short, and know what your exit plan is. And we talk about that in business too, which is it's super easy to get into something, then it takes off, but you have no exit strategy. And I think if you want to create a product line to last, you need to be thinking about your exit strategy. When does this actually end? I'm not going to beat this horse to death forever. And Stephen King didn't with the Dark Tower series. Book 7, that was it. Roland gets to the tower, and we get the end of that. Jerry Seinfeld did that with Seinfeld. He went out on top. He was a showman, right? And I think that if you sold a product to producers or to publishers, and you said, look, this is 2 books, or it's 3 books, or it's 8 episodes, or it's 2 seasons, and that's it, we're out, and we're going to invest in it. Now you know what you're building, and you can solve the pacing problem and the thread line problem, right? And then just know that product going in, if it's new and it's unknown, it's probably going to make its money over time. It's not going to have the margins of an MCU movie right off the bat, right? So different value prospect. And I wish I saw more of that nuanced conversation going on around how we make money off of some of these products and invest in, as I say with journalism, the editorial aspect of what we're doing, not just the sales.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Hollywood to know. I'm sure there are people having that conversation. I'm sure that they are being drowned out, but we need to do it now, especially since Hollywood has famously overexpanded and then tries to consolidate and then tries to expand again and then consolidates again. And it's like the 40 or 50-year-old joke that Paramount Studios is always for sale, and it's always for sale. It's for sale, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, but I don't know. I'm sure if I ruled the world, I'd make plenty of mistakes too. I mean, but it's
oh, so would I. Yeah, we haven't talked about any of my mistakes. There's lots of them.
No, you're perfect. We're not talking about your mistakes here. We're only talking about your successes here. You went from Vancouver, took a risk, and everything went straight to gold. And running a business, doing everything, getting people to come to Vancouver. All right, and speaking of that, let's land the gold. We're sort of in the end of the Olympics right now, at least when we're recording. Land the gold. Sell us on Joel McKay and why he's not Joel McHale.
Well, with me, you're getting Pulp Fiction, throwback stories, spin rack stuff, and it's set in a part of the world that maybe you don't know anything about. You're rediscovering something from and a type of storytelling that's from your past. It's fun, it's accessible. That is, if that's the feeling you want, is to capture that, then I'm your guy. And you can find my stuff online on Amazon. You can find me on X and /Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and Threads, author Joel McKay or Joel C. McKay, and let's go from there.
Excellent. Sounds good. The work sounds really interesting. It sounds really accessible. It sounds digestible, which is, in this age, I mean, let's face it, we all have shorter attention spans these days. Yeah. And we all feel like we have less time because we're probably wasting time on Facebook and social media, but we are. So, if you still want to read, and it's good to read. It's good for your brain to read. Maybe shorter is better. So, hey, if you like horror, you like fantasy, you like where they intersect and meet, you want to learn a little bit about British Columbia, it sounds like Joel McKay is what the doctor prescribed for you. Thank you very much for being on the show. When you got your next book or your first movie deal lined up, you're certainly welcome back on. Or if you just want to argue about other movies or TV shows, or tell me how From did or didn't stick the landing. We don't know what the landing is yet, or Yellow Jackets did or didn't stick the landing. I sort of feel like they've already crossed into the jumping the shark territory. But I don't know. Looking forward to season 2.
I actually don't think we're going to be arguing about those things. I think we would agree in both cases. But thanks for having me on, Jeff. It's been a lot of fun.
I appreciate it. All right, very good. Thanks very much for listening, folks, and hope you enjoyed everything. Hope you check out his stuff. Hey, Joel, I always give the guests an opportunity, and they always go, I wasn't expecting that, and so now I love doing it. What outro song do you associate with you or your work?
I don't know. Pick The Shining's main theme. Let's go with that.
The theme to The Shining? All right. Which version? Which edition? The Kubrick?
The Kubrick, the one by Wendy Carlos.
Okay. There we go. Sold. All right, everyone. You know what you're going to hear next. See you next time in the Garden of Doom.
And a rendezvous. Your eyes held a message tender, saying I surrender all my love to you. Midnight brought us sweet romance. I know